Today is Sunday, July 9th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Today on this Sunday, as I get out for a walk, the topic that I'd like to think about and talk about is correction. It's been on my mind recently because of my own personal experience, and I've wanted to talk about it. And in this society, whenever we use the word correction, it's usually used in the context of correcting someone else. We talk about fraternal correction, for example, and what that means is that I'm allowed to criticize other Christians. We always assume that we stand in the place of the one who's to be doing the correction. And we examine and watch others, read through what they have to say, listen to their talk, to see if there's anything in there that we can correct. And this is how we tend to think about correction as Christians. And in thinking like this, we've got it all upside down. This can be seen nowhere more clearly than the insanity that one can see on social media, where men and women who can barely find employment in the richest society in world history can create a free social media account, get on their phone, and start criticizing popes and bishops of the church. If you want an illustration of insanity, I would recommend the social media accounts used to criticize the Pope and bishops. And when these people are challenged, they'll respond with this crazy idea that they're doing what Christ taught us to do, because Christ taught us that it's necessary for fraternal correction. Now, first of all, and I point this out in vain to almost everyone I respond to, because I feel bad for these people. They're just so clueless, lack all self-awareness. Christ taught us about fraternal correction in Matthew chapter 18. And if the passage doesn't immediately come to your mind, and you can't immediately recite the passage where Christ teaches how a Christian is to make fraternal correction, that's problem number one. We're not even aware of Christ's teaching on such a subject. But Christ's teaching limits what might be called fraternal correction to very specific situations, none of which are fulfilled in these situations where men and women criticize bishops and popes, and this includes priests and even other bishops on social media. Jesus begins his teaching in Matthew 18 on fraternal correction by saying, "If your brother offends you, or if your brother sins against you, go and correct him, or go and speak to him between you and him alone." Go and speak to your brother who has offended you or who has sinned against you Go and speak to him between you and him alone. So right there, we have the qualification for fraternal correction is that it is in person and private. For any correction to be a fraternal correction, it would need to be in person and it would need to be private. That's what it means to make a fraternal correction. There's an old Latin phrase which into English translates as admonish in secret and praise openly, or I should say admonish privately and praise openly. And there are a number of reasons why it's necessary for true fraternal correction to be private and face-to-face. And I don't necessarily know that it needs to be live face-to-face if we normally communicate by other means, like a text message, for example, or a phone call, or even an email. But it needs to be personal and private. And there's a number of reasons why. One reason why is because correction is difficult to receive. And therefore, in light of the golden rule, where we should not do to others what we would not have someone do to us, it's not right to put someone on the spot in front of others and make them uncomfortable by correcting them publicly. We wouldn't like someone to do that to us, and therefore we shouldn't do it to someone else. And secondly, we could be wrong. It's possible that our understanding of what happened or our suspicion of the person's intention in a certain event could be wrong. I know as a father, this has happened to me on a number of occasions. I would overhear something or see something out of the corner of my eye, or just have a hunch that something was going on. And I might get angry and respond and snap at a kid or something like that, only to find out that what I thought was going on is not what was actually going on, or what I thought a child intended was not actually what he intended. And so there are times where there's an appearance of wrongdoing, and that appearance is false. And that's why it would always be good to admonish someone in private. And I'd argue there's a third reason why it's an important safeguard to correct someone privately and face-to-face, and that is that it's very difficult to do so. It's very difficult to correct someone, to admonish someone face-to-face. It's very difficult. And why I think that's a helpful safeguard is it challenges us to ask ourselves, do I really need to do this? Is this really important? Am I overreacting? Am I being oversensitive? Is this really necessary? And if we can answer no to questions about whether it's necessary and urgent, then we probably shouldn't go ahead with this attempt to admonish and correct someone. After all, one of the works of mercy is to bear wrongs patiently. Not to be like a mousetrap set to go off anytime someone touches it. That's not a Christian spirit. To always be ready to be offended is not a Christian spirit. And Jesus models this balance in his own life for us to give us an example that we can follow in his steps. There are times when he snaps, that's true. But he's constantly being offended, spoken of against falsely, doubted, betrayed, lied about, mistreated, on and on. And we see him bear these things patiently in so many situations. He doesn't just snap. People love to talk about him flipping the tables over in the temple as if that justifies their constant anger and criticism of others. But they don't talk about all the other instances in Christ's life where he deals with wrongs patiently and quietly. It's funny how you can pick one event and ignore 50 to try to justify a vice in your own life. So anyway, when we talk about fraternal correction, go and admonish your brother between you and him alone. That eliminates all, 100% of the criticism of popes and bishops on the internet, among those who try to somehow argue that they're just carrying out the work of fraternal correction, which is really ridiculous. We also need to realize that Jesus warned us. He warned us about thinking of ourselves as correctors of others. He warned us that we're not to think of ourselves as the correctors of all of our neighbors. He said, how can you, with a log in your own eye, go and attempt to correct your brother who has a splinter in his eye? First, take the log out of your own eye, and then, notice he says, then you will be able to see clearly and can remove the splinter from your brother's eye. So there's a lot of guidance in that illustration that our Lord gives us. Anyone who has a right disposition as a Christian knows that he's got logs in his own eyes and should doubt himself and know that it's not only possible but likely that he will judge wrongly in many situations. And so wisdom always teaches us to reserve judgment, to continue to observe and gather information, not to be quick to judge, because it's unjust. Plus, that kind of judgment and that work of correcting others should be done by mature Christians who are disciplined in the spiritual life, who understand spiritual things. It's not for us to imagine that we're all spiritual masters. And this is what I think our Lord meant when he said, first, take the log out of your own eye. First, prepare yourself by cultivating a contemplative life, by cultivating a holy life rich in wisdom through study and prayer and worship, participation in the sacraments, the study of the writings of the doctors of the church, and so on, cultivate true wisdom and holiness, be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that you can see clearly and can actually help to remove the splinter that is in your brother's eye. And so you can see clearly from the scriptures that we're not being shoved into the world to go and nag and nitpick everyone we come in contact with. In fact, I would argue that Jesus teaches us the opposite. But that's all I wanted to say about us correcting others. That's really not what I want to talk about. What I'd like to talk about is us receiving correction from others. Because it's very important for us to be able to receive correction. And as I said before, it's very difficult. I don't know that anything could be more difficult to bear or receive than correction. And yet we have to learn how to receive correction, or we really won't grow in areas where we need to grow. And I'll share a personal story to illustrate this. Most of you listening to these talks know what I do. You know about my work in Catholic education, that I founded the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, that I've done 25 years of research and work restoring real classical Catholic education. I've got thousands of students. I'm also a father with 10 children. I consider myself to be a faithful Catholic. And I'm very busy. Very busy. And I'm living as a husband. I'm trying to be a loving, generous, sacrificial husband, imitating Christ and his love for the church. As I said, I have 10 children. I try to be a good and loving father, generous and patient. I've also got obligations to my parents. And on top of all of that, there's the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And I try to serve the parents and students in the academy generously. And when you add all those things together, my schedule is filled from the time I wake up in the morning until the time I finally collapse in bed and sleep for 4 or 5 hours. I'm busy the whole day, and I consider myself to be busy doing Christian work almost the whole time. And yet in my life there are many areas where I have things screwed up. There are many areas that I honestly just don't get to because of other things that I'm doing. And they're not necessarily my will. It's not my desire that they're so. Often I'm helping other people with their problems, and I allow problems to develop in my own life because I say, well, this for this person is urgent. I can take care of my problems later when I get a chance. But let me take care of this for this person today. And so I get myself into all kind of trouble, and then I have these times where I get some time for myself and I work through those things, get my own affairs squared away, and kind of get my head above water again. And that's how I live. So there's always stuff in my own personal life that isn't as it should be. Whether it's being behind on taxes or late paying a bill or just failing to do some simple things like home maintenance or respond to a message to someone. I tend to put my tasks last and try to take care of things other people need from me first. So in the midst of that life, occasionally someone will come to me and criticize me for something that I'm neglecting. They'll attempt to correct me for something. And you can imagine my natural response, and when I say natural, I mean fallen human, carnal response. My natural response is, give me a break, bro. Give me a break. I'm doing all this. I never take a rest. I'm busy all day, every day. And you're going to come and point out some problem as if I don't know about that already? Give me a break. Get a life. That's the natural response. Or I can go even further and include something like, what about you? You're not doing anything, and you're going to sit here and criticize me? That's the natural response to criticism or an attempt at correction. And let's be honest, many times that response is reasonable. We often are approached by someone who's idle, not doing anything, and it's as if they're studying our life, ignoring the 99 good things that are done, and zeroing in on the one neglected thing, and deciding to make that the topic of discussion. And it's annoying. And sometimes those people do need to get a life. And that response is just, but there's a bigger issue to consider. And look, there are annoying people in the world. They're annoying, they have no friends, they annoy everybody. They're like flies and mosquitoes. That's just how they are. They're annoying people. And most of the people who I mentioned before, criticizing popes and bishops, that's the kind of people they are. And it's easy for us to get annoyed. It's easy for us to respond with some kind of personal attack, like tit for tat response, as if their bad behavior justifies our bad behavior, which of course makes no sense. And it just reveals that we're not in the right disposition. And Jesus teaches us about this, because he knows what people are like. He knows that they're annoying. He knows that most of the time we face correction, it's going to come from some backwards hypocrite that's got 10 times as many problems as we do. Or it's going to come in an appropriate circumstance, or at an inappropriate time, or it's going to be said in an inappropriate way. And so our Lord teaches us how to think about correction. And it's challenging. He talks about how the hypocrites, how the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders, the teachers of the Jews in his day, were scandalous hypocrites. They talked about all kinds of religious obligations. They argued about the details of the laws and all the requirements of their traditions. They gave people a hard time all the time, and yet they themselves didn't practice any of it. Jesus criticized them and said, you strain out the gnats, you pick out the little things while you swallow the camel. An obviously ridiculous hyperbole, figure of speech, to reveal the nature of the problem. You critics, and notice that the word hypocritical, has critic, which in Greek refers to judgment. He warns that those who are critics are hypocritical. They pretend to be concerned about the details of the law, but their lives reveal no real concern for the things they talk about. And this is true of just about everyone who spends their time criticizing the Pope, the bishops, politicians, and so on. There are people who find fault with, they actually study to find fault. They constantly are hunting for faults in the lives of people doing all kinds of great works in offices that no one can appoint themselves to, while they sit idle on the internet. And we can see how this judgment is hypocritical. And that's again why our natural reaction to that is usually to say, get a life. Go find something to do. Or to say something like, the only people who can make mistakes are those who are actually doing things. So the correction and the criticism is often presented to us in an annoying way, an irritating way. And that's what makes correction difficult. Now, you can multiply that by 1,000 when the person does it wrongly and they offer that criticism publicly or openly. Well, that's even more annoying. And we'd be provoked even more to give some carnal, self-defending response. But Jesus teaches us not to think like that. First of all, humility, real humility, leads us to not concern ourselves with appearances, with our appearance to others or others' judgment of us, but to concern ourselves with what's true, with what's real in the presence of God. Humility doesn't get upset thinking about what others might think, because we know that their judgment may be ignorant or unjust. They don't know all the details. There are most people, I would say, most people get very upset thinking about what others are going to think because they're prideful. And they want everyone else to think well of them all the time, even if it means that they have to play some kind of act to appear to be something that they're not. Where humility frees us from that and allows us to accept and ignore the unjust judgments of others, even if it humiliates us in a crowd. We don't seek honor from men. We don't seek praise. We don't seek to be celebrated or congratulated. We're really concerned with what God thinks of us, who actually knows every detail of our life, both visible and invisible. And if we think like this, if we think about living in the presence of God, or before the face of God, that's what the old Latin phrase coram Deo means. If we think about living with our only concern to be just and true in the sight of God who knows all the details, it puts us in a different disposition. And Jesus teaches this humble disposition. He teaches us to listen to what the hypocrites say. Listen to what the hypocrites say. Because their criticism, even if everything about it, rhetorically speaking, is wrong. It's the wrong time, they're not the right guy, it's the wrong place, it's said in the wrong way. Even though every aspect of the criticism or the correction is wrong, what Jesus tells us to do is to receive it. Ignore all of that other stuff and just ask ourselves, is what he says true? Is what the person says true? We don't even have to respond. That's part of the hard part, is we always feel like we've got to respond. But what we do need to ask ourselves, again, in the presence of God, is what the person said true? Is the criticism fair? That's all that matters. And again, we don't have to defend ourselves. We don't have to acquit ourselves. We don't have to say anything. We just have to listen, hear what the person has to say, and then think about it. Is what this person said true? Jesus says, when referring to hypocrites and their tendency to criticize and judge others, he says, do as they say, but do not do as they do. And it's important that we realize that Jesus says, do as they say. In other words, what they say is not necessarily false, but what they do is false. Don't imitate their lifestyle. And of course, this means don't return evil for evil. Don't say, oh yeah, you think I have, well, what about you? No, don't do as they do. And don't return evil for evil. But he says, listen to what they say. And in most cases, it's going to be right to do as they say, because they may be hypocrites, but that doesn't mean that what they say is false. And so we can see how correction can be irritating, even angering, and provoke a raw carnal response from us, which is sin. And we've got to learn to not do that. There's no need to defend or acquit ourselves. We should listen to what they say, probably walk away, and ask ourselves, is what he said true? And receive the correction. This is how Jesus teaches us to respond when we're criticized or corrected. There's a great passage in the Old Testament that I always think about because I love King David. If you've never spent time reading the life of King David in the Old Testament and just reading it and rereading it and meditating on it, reflecting on it, you're really missing out on some of the best devotional material anywhere. There's a reason why God chose David to be the author of the Psalms. David lived a Christ-like life 1,000 years before Christ. He had his flaws, of course. He wasn't the Christ himself, but he was a prophet. And in many ways, he did show us the way of Christ, the mind of Christ, as Paul talks about in Philippians chapter 2. David taught us and modeled for us the mind of Christ 1,000 years before Christ came into the world. David was the king of Israel. He was a man of war. He was a great warrior. We know this because of the story of his killing Goliath, his victories in wars that are recorded in the Old Testament. He was a killer. He was a bloody man. God actually refers to him as a bloody man. God also refers to him as the man after his own heart. And so in David we find this fascinating mixture of this raw human zeal and also this Christian perfection. And David had a number of enemies that constantly provoked him. And David was trying to be a true worshiper of God. He was trying to be virtuous. He was trying to be just. He was trying to be gentle. He was trying to be patient and merciful. He was trying to live according to the Beatitudes, but he was provoked by a number of enemies that were as provocative as any enemies can get. And that's another reason why it's good to study and meditate on the life of David, to watch and learn how he deals with enemies who are constantly provoking him to evil. One of these enemies was King Saul. David was chosen by God to replace King Saul because Saul disobeyed God's commands. David was anointed to become king of Israel while Saul was still on the throne. Everybody knew this, including Saul, and Saul tried to kill David, even though David did nothing wrong. In fact, David was a loyal servant to Saul. Saul, in his royal jealousy, his insane jealousy, when he realized that David was chosen by God to be his successor, he tried to kill David. And yet David beautifully deals with Saul. Time and again, David has Saul in a position where he could easily kill him and save himself. And David chooses not to do so. He says, "Who am I to lay a hand on the Lord's anointed?" Just think of that mind of Christ present in David. And again, please read the life of David. It's so rich. And eventually Saul dies, or is killed actually, and David takes the throne with no violence ever coming from David. And David shows us the right way to handle an enemy, to overcome evil with good. Then David has another terrible enemy, his own son, Absalom. And this evil son of his, which is a great comfort to those who have disobedient children, to know that it's not necessarily because of mom or dad. The same David who raised Solomon also had a son named Absalom, who was a wicked menace in his father's life. And David, being a king and leader of an army, was surrounded by a bunch of killers. He was surrounded by men like Joab, who were just trained killers, experienced warriors. And when they saw Absalom dishonoring his father, they would step up and ask David, "Can we kill this guy?" And David would constantly plead with them to spare Absalom's life, even though he threatened David's life physically. David constantly pleaded with his soldiers and the leaders under him to not give Absalom what he deserved, but to be patient and to spare him for David's sake. And they did so for a while, but finally, when the opportunity came, one of them took advantage of one of Absalom's misfortunes and did away with him. And David famously mourned for his son Absalom. The mourning of David for Absalom became a famous piece of music in Renaissance polyphony. You can look it up. You can Google or go on YouTube and search for the Latin phrase Lugebat David, Lugebat, Lugebat David, David. So the mourning of David for Absalom, again, models for us the willingness to bear wrongs patiently for the good of someone else. And we see this again and again in the life of David. And again, this should mold in us a right disposition, to have the mind in us which was in Christ. But there's another opponent, much less significant than Saul or Absalom, that's important for us to meditate on when we talk about correction. And unfortunately, I didn't prepare this talk as usual, and this is sort of coming off the top of my head. But the man's name in the Old Testament, again, you can look this up because it's worth reading the passage, and I might not include all the details or remember all the details exactly. But there's a man in the Old Testament in the life of David. His name is Shimei. 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 It may be spelled in some translation without the H. In one story, and again, I don't have all the details of the story in mind, but the key event in the story is what I want to share. David is traveling, he's walking along through the roads with his men, with his leading men around him. And as he's walking through the towns, there's this man named Shimei who comes out and stands on a hill beside the road. And when David is passing by, he starts cursing David because of casualties in battles that others have suffered because of David's wars. And this man comes out and is cursing David, calling down curses on him, and throwing dirt and rocks at King David while he's surrounded by this team of executioners. This guy's really angry at David, cursing, throwing rocks, throwing dirt at the king. And so David's men turn to David and say, "Do you want us to dispatch this dude? You want us to eliminate this guy?" And David's response teaches us how to respond to correction. Because this man is angry with David. He's accusing David of evil, maybe not evil deeds that David has done, but evil consequences of things that David's men have done. And David is listening. He's listening to this man, Shimei, and he's thinking, as we should when we're criticized, and he's asking himself, is what this man says true? David is receiving this criticism the right way, modeling for us in a situation that appears ridiculous. The king, the famous David, being cursed and disrespected, having stones and dirt thrown at him by some nobody. He's being criticized in a ridiculous way, and David's men respond to the criticism in light of that. Do you want us to eliminate this guy? And David says no. And what David says after that is what's most important. David says, how do I know that the Lord hasn't sent him to say these things to me? Maybe God has actually sent Shimei to speak to me and warn me because I'm headed down a bad path, and Shimei is God's chosen instrument to warn me and correct me. And it's that thought that I think is the key to receiving correction. It doesn't matter what Shimei is doing. It doesn't matter whether he's doing it the right way or if he's mixing half-truths with whole truths or exaggerating things and speaking out publicly in a humiliating way that's not appropriate. That really doesn't matter to a humble person who doesn't care about those things anyway. It's that one question that David asks that's really the key. What if God sent this person to offer this criticism? What if this is God speaking to me through this instrument? If that's possible, then I'd better be careful and listen to what he has to say. It doesn't matter, again, it doesn't matter how he says it or who he is or the fact that he's presenting this message in an insulting way. David says, perhaps the Lord sent him. And in that we see that humble and thoughtful disposition of David that makes him David. And so again, even though he faces a ridiculous situation, he doesn't return evil for evil, but he imitates the Blessed Virgin Mary, who, remember in the Gospels, we always read she pondered these things in her heart. She didn't start blabbing. She didn't share her opinion. She didn't start objecting to things she didn't understand or stomping her feet and demanding an explanation. She was just quiet and patient. And she just observed, collected all of these experiences and reflected on them quietly and privately. And we see that disposition is necessary to receive correction. Now, before I mentioned that there was a personal experience that I wanted to share, because I've been challenged in this way recently, and that's what made this all fresh in my mind and made me want to talk about it, because I want to think about it myself. I mentioned in a talk a few weeks ago that my family had moved to a new parish. And we did so because our old parish just wasn't right for my kids. I don't care. I can worship God anywhere. I've been in a third world country at Mass. I'm not the kind of person that goes into a church and starts looking at the paintings and the stained glass and the architecture and then listens to the music and judges things and needs to be in the perfect location. I'm able to focus and keep my eyes on the main thing. But that's not necessarily true for my kids. And so after a lot of reflection, some advice we received from others, and talking through things with my wife, we decided to go to a new parish, a parish where we knew things were run a lot more strictly. And we thought, well, you know what, this will be good for the kids, because the kids will hear a lot of the things that we teach them at home coming from the pulpit. Our teaching, our moral teaching, our cultural teaching, our religious instruction will be reinforced from the pulpit. And so it'll be good for our kids to be there. Our kids have been able to get away with a lot because the things that we teach them in our old parish, we were the only source of those teachings. And it gave the kids a feeling that they could dismiss them because, well, the church doesn't say that. Whereas what was true was this parish doesn't say what we say, but most parishes, every good parish certainly does say what we say. And so we started attending a new parish. Now, I was hesitant to change parishes. I'll be honest. I was hesitant to change parishes because there's one thing about our old parish that I liked. As many faults as there might be, it was not filled with political talk. The priest wasn't a political activist. We didn't have to hear about every headline. We didn't have to hear the criticism of the Democrats. We didn't have to hear about all the political controversies. The homily wasn't turned into a pro-life movement message. I didn't have to have Mass distracted with secular politics. That's one thing that I liked about our old parish. But that's because they really talked about nothing. But the absence of political talk, I appreciated. And I knew, because I was familiar with the priest at this other parish, I had seen homilies of his on the internet because he's quite well known. I knew that he liked to get into political controversies. And so I had known about this other parish for some time, but I chose not to go there because I really don't want to be in a political parish. I had to deal with that as a Protestant, and I always hated it because these are controversial issues, and controversial issues shouldn't be addressed in a homily because there's no opportunity for anyone to respond or object. And that's how controversial issues should be discussed. They should be discussed in a context where someone may prepare a talk or an essay in response to a controversial question, but then people have to be allowed to raise objections. Otherwise, you just get this echo chamber of one person sharing his opinions with no accountability to any objections or examination of the things that are said. And I really hate when preachers do that. And I had a feeling that going to this parish, as much as there may be good things gained, especially for my kids, because to be honest, I don't necessarily think it's bad for the kids to hear this political preaching, because they're carnal and they can get stirred up with political things, whereas I really am not primarily interested in politics. So I was hesitant about going there because of the political stuff, and yet we decided to make the change and go there for the kids' sake. And as we went there, immediately it was as if the temperature was turned up 100 degrees. The preaching was cutting for everyone. I know my kids came home embarrassed the first week because he got into things that were true of them, said things that embarrassed them. And it was necessary for us to hear that. It was necessary for my kids to hear that. Again, that was partly what I was looking forward to, was my kids hearing strong, moral Catholic teaching from the priest. That's what I was looking forward to. However, it was pretty plain that some of the moral teaching was hypocritical or self-contradicting. Some of it was presented in a way that wasn't appropriate for a Mass, where people don't have the chance. For example, let me give you an example. To criticize people for wearing shorts to Mass while people may be sitting in Mass in shorts, I think is unfair. Because the people don't have the opportunity to change. And so it puts them in a very awkward position to be isolated like that, where they're wearing shorts, and now it's being yelled about that you shouldn't wear shorts to Mass. I think that's inappropriate for Mass. When we're at Mass, I think that everyone should be appreciative of the people who've chosen to come to Mass. I don't think that people who choose to obey God and go to Mass should then be attacked while a billion people disobey God and don't go to Mass. It gets into the situation where the criminals are never spoken badly of, and the people trying to obey the laws are the ones always getting criticized and troubled by the police. I'm getting pulled over for an expired license plate registration with a cop giving me a hard time as I'm driving to work at 7 o'clock in the morning. I get a hard time from a cop because my registration expired. Meanwhile, everyone knows that there's drugs and prostitution all through town. And a working guy with an expired registration is getting the heat from the police. That gets annoying. Even though it's just, it gets annoying. And sometimes it feels that way, where the only people who get criticized by the priests are the people who actually come to Mass. And there are people who have made great sacrifices, who've humbled themselves and returned to church only to receive criticism when they're there. And I really hate the thought of that. If you're going to correct someone, correct them privately, where they have the opportunity to change, or at least to give an explanation. Maybe the person just got home from traveling late the night before, didn't have clothes ready, and just put on what was available to get to Mass. So there are circumstances where the person's not necessarily doing something intentionally, and that's why admonishing openly can be inappropriate. So while the criticism was true and beneficial for us all to hear, I think it went over the line and made the kids feel uncomfortable for things that really weren't a cause of offense. And some of the things, to be honest, some of the things spoken of tend to cut me personally as well. For example, one of the things that gets annoying as a Catholic is it feels that no matter how much you do, someone always likes to talk about the next thing. You make it to Mass on Sundays, that's cool. Oh, you pray the Liturgy of the Hours, that's cool. You pray the Rosary, that's cool. What about First Fridays? You go to adoration? First Fridays? Oh, no, you don't do that. What about Brown Scapular? You do that? Oh, no, you don't do that. What about First Saturday? What about that? What about adoration on Monday evenings? You do that? No, oh, you don't do that? And it could just go on forever like that as a Catholic. It seems that there are people who always like to talk about what the next thing might be. And again, they may not do half the things themselves, but they love to talk about the next thing. And I get annoyed by that because I'm prideful. And I think I'm doing this, and I'm doing this, and I'm doing this, and I pray liturgy hours. I became a lay Dominican. I pray the rosary. I go to Mass as often as I can. I go to Mass, bring a whole family, 12 people to Mass on Sundays for 20 years now. And what's the topic of discussion? Why am I not at nocturnal adoration? And so I get irritated. I get annoyed by that kind of stuff because I feel like I'm doing so many things, especially considering where I've come from. And if I do 10 things, we're going to talk about the 11th thing. And if I do 11 things, we're going to talk about the 12th thing. And frankly, that gets annoying because there's 2,000 years of Catholic tradition, and these kinds of things will never stop. So it's annoying. But then I start thinking about it, and that little voice of conscience, the little built-in wife that God put in every one of us, starts asking questions. Well, you're self-employed. Why don't you go to nocturnal adoration on First Fridays? Well, you're self-employed. Why don't you go to adoration on Monday evening? Why don't you go to Mass on Wednesday at noon? Why don't you go? You're self-employed. You got no boss. You make the schedule. Why don't you go? And as annoying as it is, if you're honest, you have to say, I don't have any answer for why I don't go. And maybe that's why it's actually annoying, is because it feels like, you got me. There's no explanation for why I don't do that. That's actually why it's irritating. I've already got my 4 or 5 things in place. I feel pretty good. I'm already doing some extra credit work. I don't care about this other thing. But conscience is there to say, did you listen to what he said? He asked why more parishioners don't come to nocturnal adoration on First Fridays. What's your answer? And I say, I have no answer. Of course I could go. Of course, if I would think about what I'm being asked to do, there would be nothing in the universe that's a higher priority. Of course, if I believe that the creator of the universe and redeemer of the world is present with us at adoration, of course, any objection is insane. And so what ends up happening? I go to nocturnal adoration, love it, drive home and say to myself, you know why you went to nocturnal adoration? Because that priest irritatingly urged you to do so. And that irritation is good for us. It's good for us to be in the presence of that constant prodding. You wonder, as I often do, what the benefit of marriage is other than having a constant live-in critic and nag over your shoulder 24 hours a day. And I have to admit that while it's annoying, it's pretty effective. While I was a Protestant, there was a funny story. One of the preachers who was famous, he had published tons of books, was a worldwide speaker, theologian, founder of a college and seminary, had accomplished all of these amazing things, was, like I said, had radio shows all over the world, very famous, and yet he was a humble man. He was a humble man, and people appreciated his humility, and at a conference one time, someone stood up during a Q&A session and asked, with all of these successes and all of this influence, how do you remain humble in the midst of all that? How do you remain humble? And he answered real quick, and he said, I'm married. And that's the truth. Our wives don't care who we are. It's especially true for me. My wife and I met when I was 17. And I think when she looks at me, she still sees 17-year-old Billy Michael, the class clown at Edison High School, and she still talks to me as if I'm that 17-year-old moron. And you really see how that relationship really is an anchor spiritually that just keeps us free from pride. Because our wives don't care who we are. They don't care that we made money last month. They're talking about next month. And while we can get irritated by that and complain about it, we have to admit it's good for us. We'd be a lot worse off without that live-in critic. It's good for us. And the same is true of correction in whatever form that it comes. If we have a right disposition, if we have the disposition of David, if we have that disposition that our Lord taught us to have, we have to learn that any criticism we receive, even if it's from the most ridiculous sources, that criticism, even if it's sinful on their part, and the nagging of a wife can be sinful, even if it's sinful for that person, it can still be good for us. And at this new parish, I've had a number of occasions where I was irritated because something that was said cut me a little bit. And the thought comes into your head where you say, I knew we shouldn't have come to this parish. But this is what we were missing at our old parish. We were never challenged. We were never criticized. No one ever talked about standards that were beyond our standards. We were very comfortable. And as soon as we came into the new parish, it was like all kinds of sores and ulcers and problems were exposed that were allowed to just fester at our old parish. And it's been challenging to address them and respond to them, but I thank God for the opportunity, because there are things that we wouldn't have challenged ourselves to do. And when we're challenged, we're going to respond positively. We're going to respond. We want to be perfect. But that initial challenge is annoying. It's irritating. And that's what makes it hard to receive correction. So my point in this talk, I wanted to share that story and these reflections because I've been encouraged recently by the realization that this kind of irritating correction helps us to grow. And we shouldn't worry about the instrument. We shouldn't worry about who it is that says it or how it's said. We shouldn't defend ourselves or acquit ourselves. We should just listen and in the presence of God reflect and ask, is this true? Is this true? Think like David and say, is it possible that God has sent this message to me to help me out of a rut that I'm in, or to warn me of a path that I'm starting to head down? In the Old Testament, Balaam was warned that he was headed down a wrong path because an angel stood in the path that Balaam could not see, but his donkey saw the angel. And the donkey got spooked and went nuts. And Balaam was saved from going down a bad path by an instrument that he certainly didn't appreciate. And so we've got to be careful that God isn't sending us these little whispers of warnings to pump the brakes, or change direction, or think twice about what we're doing. He may choose to reveal these things to us through unattractive messengers, because that gives us the opportunity to merit reward for humility. Whereas if we're prideful, we'll just dismiss a messenger who's not respectable, someone we think is beneath us, who doesn't have the right to talk to us like that. We could just brush that aside in our pride and get the punishment we deserve. Not only for ignoring the admonition, but for allowing pride to remain in us and control us. So it's sort of a twofold test. A test whether we're willing to receive correction and listen, and a test of whether we're humble enough to consider whether God isn't using an unexpected instrument to warn us, to correct us before we get into trouble. And after all, aren't we all unworthy instruments for the things that we do? Like St. Paul said, who is sufficient for these things? None of us are qualified to be Christians. I laugh when I think about becoming a Dominican, that I'm accepted into the order of preachers as if I am worthy of being a member of the family of St. Dominic. But that's what Christ does. He takes the humble things of the world and uses them to confound the proud. So anyway, I hope that that's a helpful talk, reflection on receiving correction. Again, it's something that I've been dealing with recently as we've changed parishes, something that I've dealt with throughout my life as a father and as a husband. I've always listened to complaints that my kids make or that my wife makes and ask, is what they're saying true? As much as I want to pile drive them right now, is what they're saying true? And often it is. And we need to be careful that we're listening, because like David in the presence of Shimei, maybe the Lord is sending this person to say these things to us, to warn us and to help us. I hope that's helpful. God bless.